The wind, a constant unseen sculptor, had worked its patient art for 5 years. It had abraded granite, shifted scree, and whispered secrets through the high passes of the Sierra Nevada. On August 14, 2010, two amateur hikers, father and son, embarked on a day trip from the Onion Valley trailhead, their ambition a modest loop toward Kearsarge Pass. They sought panoramic views, the thin air, the escape. They found something else. At precisely 12,100 feet, just shy of the pass itself, a glint. A shard of unnatural blue amidst the muted tones of rock and sky. It lay nestled against a lichen-dusted boulder, half buried by the persistent grit of the mountain. The father, a man named Robert Jenkins, a retired engineer with an eye for anomalies, knelt. He brushed away the fine dust. It was a small, rugged camera, its casing cracked but largely intact, a faded blue strap still attached. A GoPro Hero 3, a model that had been cutting edge at the turn of the millennium. Robert knew GoPros. He owned a newer model himself. This one, however, felt different. It felt heavy, imbued with a silence that was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of a story untold. He carefully retrieved it, the cold plastic a stark contrast to the warmth of the sun on his gloved fingers. His son, a restless teenager, was already 20 yards ahead, oblivious. Robert turned the device over. The power indicator light remarkably flickered, a faint, almost imperceptible pulse of green. The battery, against all odds, held a charge. This was the impossible discovery. This was the hook. The camera, later catalogued as evidence item number 2010 SAR114A, belonged to Dr. Evelyn Reed. Evelyn, a name now synonymous with an enduring high-altitude mystery, had vanished without a trace 5 years earlier, on September 22, 2005. Her disappearance had launched one of the most extensive search and rescue operations in Sierra Nevada history. It had yielded nothing, no body, no gear, no definitive trail, just silence. And now, this. This small plastic box, a digital sarcophagus, had emerged from the void. The initial forensics were swift. The camera was carefully opened, its internal components exposed to the sterile light of a lab. The memory card, a minuscule SD card, was remarkably preserved. Its gold contacts were tarnished but functional. A forensic image was created, a bit-for-bit copy, to ensure no data was lost or corrupted during analysis. The contents were then revealed, a series of high-definition video files dated from September 20th to September 22nd, 2005. The last timestamp, 11:47 a.m., September 22nd. Evelyn Reed was not an amateur. She was, by every metric, an expert. A seasoned mountaineer, a wilderness first responder, and an accomplished ultra-runner. Her resume read like a treatise on preparedness, certified in advanced wilderness navigation, trained in glacier travel and crevasse rescue, a veteran of expeditions to Patagonia and the Himalayas. She approached the mountains with a methodical reverence, a meticulous planning that bordered on obsession. Her gear lists were legendary among her climbing partners. Every item accounted for, every contingency considered. This was the rule of irony in its cruelest manifestation. Her greatest strength, her unwavering preparedness, had ultimately failed to save her. Her September 2005 trip was intended as a solo traverse of a challenging, seldom-traveled route, the full north-to-south Sierra High Route, a 195-mile journey across some of the most remote and rugged terrain in the continental United States. It was a route designed for solitude, for self-reliance, for the kind of deep communion with nature that Evelyn craved. Her permit, filed meticulously, indicated a planned exit date of October 5th. When she failed to check in by October 7th, the alarm was raised. The initial search effort involved dozens of ground teams, K-9 units, and aerial reconnaissance. Thermal imaging cameras scanned the ridgelines for heat signatures. Helicopters buzzed the remote cirques, their rotors a desperate futile prayer against the vastness. They found nothing. The mountains, impassive and ancient, kept their secrets. The prevailing theory, born of exhaustion and lack of evidence, was a fall, a misstep on a treacherous scree slope, an unseen patch of ice, a sudden gust of wind. Her body, it was assumed, had simply been swallowed by the terrain, perhaps buried under a rock slide or lost to an inaccessible crevasse. The mountains don't explain why, they simply absorb. Now, with the discovery of the GoPro, the narrative shifted. The silence was broken, replaced by the faint echo of Evelyn's final days. The footage offered a haunting, intimate glimpse into her meticulously documented journey. The first files, dated September 20th, showed Evelyn at the trailhead, a self-shot video of her adjusting her pack, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Day 1, she narrated, her voice clear and confident against the chirping of unseen birds. "Feeling strong. Weather looks clear for the next few days. Targeting Mather Pass by tomorrow afternoon." The subsequent videos documented her progress. Sweeping panoramas of pristine alpine lakes, close-ups of delicate wildflowers, the rhythmic crunch of her boots on granite paths. She narrated her thoughts, her observations, her emotional state. Her voice, calm and analytical, revealed no hint of distress. At 7:02 a.m. on September 21st, a quick shot of her boiling water for coffee, steam rising into the crisp morning air. At 8:19 a.m., a time-lapse of her breaking camp, her movements efficient and practiced. The metadata embedded in each video file, the precise GPS coordinates and timestamps, allowed investigators to meticulously retrace her path. Every frame a breadcrumb, every second a clue. The footage from September 21st placed her well on track, traversing challenging cross-country sections with remarkable ease. Her internal monologue, captured by the camera's microphone, spoke of the exhilaration of solitude, the purity of the high alpine environment. Quote, "Trout," she whispered into the lens at one point. Quote, "Imagine you are Evelyn standing on that summit, the world spread out beneath you, a tapestry of jagged peaks and glacial valleys, the sky an impossibly deep blue, the sun a benign presence warming your skin. You are at the peak of your physical and mental prowess, surrounded by the wild beauty you so deeply cherish. What could possibly go wrong?" The evidence log from her backpack, recovered years later from a separate, unrelated find, would list items like a satellite messenger, a robust first aid kit, a water filter, emergency bivvy, all the tools of survival, all rendered moot. The final day, September 22nd, began like any other. The morning light cast long shadows across the rugged terrain. Evelyn's first recording of the day, timestamped 6:15 a.m., showed her emerging from her tent, steam rising from her breath in the cold morning air. She performed a series of stretches, her movements fluid and deliberate, a testament to her athletic discipline. The camera then captured her preparing breakfast, a small, efficient stove hissing quietly as she heated water for instant oatmeal. She spoke to the camera, her voice a calm murmur. Quote 4. The elevation data from her GPS, integrated with the video metadata, showed a steady ascent. The scenery grew more stark, more exposed. The lushness of the lower valleys gave way to the austere beauty of the alpine tundra. At 9:03 a.m., she recorded a sweeping panorama from a minor ridge, pointing out distant landmarks, her finger tracing imaginary lines across the horizon. Her eyes, visible in the reflection of the camera lens, held a familiar spark of joy and determination. The wind picked up slightly in this footage, a low, constant moan that hinted at the forces at play at such altitudes. Yet, Evelyn seemed unfazed. This was her element. At 10:18 a.m., the footage showed her navigating a short, steep section of granite slabs, her climbing poles tapping rhythmically against the rock. Her foot placement was precise, her balance impeccable. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of fatigue or disorientation. She was moving with the grace and confidence of someone entirely at home in this unforgiving environment. The sun was now high, directly overhead, casting harsh, short shadows. The light was intense, almost blinding in its clarity. then the anomaly. At 11:34 a.m., the camera, which Evelyn had typically mounted to the shoulder strap of her pack, appeared to have been repositioned. The perspective shifted, now lower, angled slightly upward. It captured her right hand, reaching out of frame as if adjusting something, perhaps the camera itself. Her breathing, usually steady, seemed to deepen for a moment, a subtle intake of air that suggested exertion or perhaps a sudden awareness. The background, a blur of granite and blue sky, remained constant. At 11:39 a.m., a short, sharp gasp. It was barely audible, almost lost beneath the omnipresent sigh of the wind. The camera jolted, a sudden violent movement that rendered the footage momentarily indecipherable. When it stabilized, the perspective was dramatically different. The world was now inverted, a dizzying swirl of gray rock and azure sky. The camera was no longer attached to her pack. It was falling. The fall was brief, a chaotic tumble of less than 3 seconds. It ended with a sickening thud, the camera impacting against a hard surface. The final image, time-stamped 11:47 a.m., September 22nd, was a frozen frame of distorted light and shadow, a blurred mosaic of rock and sparse vegetation. Then silence, utter and complete. No signal, no trace, just silence. The finality of it was absolute, a chilling testament to the unforgiving nature of the mountains. This was not a graceful descent. This was an abrupt cessation. The location where the camera was found nearly 5 years later offered a chilling corroboration. It lay nestled in a gully, perhaps 50 feet below a prominent ridgeline that Evelyn would have been traversing. The terrain there was a deceptive mix of solid granite and loose scree, a place where a single misplaced step could have catastrophic consequences. The initial fall, if it was indeed a fall, would have been short but violent. The camera's trajectory, the way it had landed and settled, suggested it had detached from her person during the initial impact. But why? Why in that moment at 11:34 a.m. did her breathing deepen? Why the gasp? The camera's sudden repositioning remained an open loop. Was she reaching for something? Was she startled? The mountains don't explain why. They keep their secrets. This wasn't a slow, drawn-out battle against the elements. It was an instant, a single irreversible moment. The investigation, revitalized by the GoPro footage, launched new theories. Was it a slip, a rockfall, a sudden medical event? The fact that her body was never found, despite the camera's relatively precise landing zone, added another layer of grim intrigue. If the camera had detached so close to her final moments, where was she? Had she continued to fall? Had some other force intervened? The fragmented emphasis of the evidence was stark. A prepared individual, a sudden gasp, a camera falling, then nothing. Just silence. The quote 5 in this case became the collective consciousness of those who studied the footage, meticulously replaying the final seconds, searching for a sign, a whisper, a reason. They were proxies for the audience, obsessed with the granular details, attempting to reconstruct the impossible. The raw data, devoid of emotion, became saturated with it through their interpretation. Every pixel, every faint sound scrutinized for a truth that remained stubbornly elusive. The emotional tone shifted from mere analysis to a haunting melancholy, a profound sense of loss for a life meticulously lived and abruptly ended. The language style adopted a forensic casual cadence, explaining concepts like GPS drift, the subtle inaccuracies inherent in satellite positioning, not just as technical jargon but as a potential factor in search patterns, a frustrating variable in an already impossible equation. The footage itself, viewed through the lens of a storyteller, became a narrative of a singular tragic moment. The thermal imaging from the original search, which had yielded nothing, now felt like a desperate blind flailing against an invisible adversary. The lack of a heat signature was not merely an absence, it was an affirmation of nothingness. The common devices of this narrative style became critical. The rule of irony was laid bare. Evelyn's satellite messenger, a beacon of modern safety, remained in her pack, presumably with her, broadcasting no signal. Her robust first aid kit containing tourniquets and splints lay unused. Her meticulous planning, her detailed logs, all pointed to a future that never arrived. The evidence log, if one could conjure it for her remaining possessions, would be a testament to a life lived with purpose and foresight, now rendered poignant by its abrupt end. The Kakandi, quote 6. Question haunted every frame of the final seconds. Why would she reposition the camera? What caused the gasp? What transpired in those critical 13 seconds between the gasp at 11:39 a.m. and the final image at 11:47 a.m.? The camera had fallen, yes, but had she fallen with it? Or was she still on the ridge looking down, helpless? The mountains don't explain why. They remain silent, stoic guardians of their unyielding truths. The rhetorical echoes began to resonate through the collective memory of the incident. The mountains don't explain why. The mountains keep their secrets. These phrases, repeated in various contexts, underscored the inherent mystery, the enduring unanswered questions that clung to Evelyn Reed's disappearance. It wasn't just a physical void, but a narrative one, a story with a beginning and an abrupt, incomprehensible middle, lacking a definitive end. The visual cue prompts for this narrative would be a slow pan over the weathered GoPro, its blue casing faded by sun and wind, the cracked lens a silent witness. Flashbulb transitions would punctuate the time-stamped photos from her journey, each image a brief, vivid memory. Static-filled archival footage from the initial search, graining and distorted, would contrast sharply with the clarity of Evelyn's own recordings, emphasizing the vast difference between external observation and internal experience. Text overlays of specific dates and times would ground the abstract passage of time in the concrete reality of the forensic record. Macro shots of the dirt, moss, and rust adhering to the camera would emphasize the relentless passage of time, the mountain's patient reclamation. The emotional tone of this story was undeniably haunting and melancholic. It balanced the horror of a sudden, unexplained death with a profound sense of, quote, 9. Though Evelyn could not be brought back, her story, her final moments could be retrieved, analyzed, and shared. Her spirit, her meticulousness, her love for the wild were etched into those final frames. It was not a celebratory act, but one of solemn remembrance, a tribute to a life lived fully, cut short too soon. The point of view remained that of a third-person omniscient narrator, acting as a, quote, 10 essayist, sifting through the evidence years later, attempting to construct a coherent narrative from fragmented truths. This narrator was not a participant, but a scholar of tragedy, driven by an insatiable need to understand, even when understanding remained elusive. The language, forensic casual, imbued technical terms with a narrative weight. A quote 11 was not just a digital copy, it was a mirror reflecting the last vestiges of a human presence. A quote 12 sweep was not just a procedure, it was a desperate plea against the cold, unforgiving vastness. The audience addressing style, direct and contemplative, would place the viewers squarely in Evelyn's shoes. Quote 13. It would prompt, inviting empathy, fostering a connection to the lost individual, and then it would end with a moral warning, a subtle reminder of the inherent dangers, the unpredictable nature of the wild, and the ultimate fragility of human life in the face of such grandeur. The mountains do not discriminate. They are simply mountains, and they keep their secrets. The silence, after all, is their most profound utterance. The forensic reconstruction of Evelyn Reed's final hours requires an obsession with the mundane. To understand the transition from an expert navigator to a missing person, one must dissect the metadata of the recovered SD card as if it were a physical trail of blood. The digital footprint left on item number 2010-SAR-114A suggests that at 11:34 a.m., Evelyn was not merely hiking, she was observing. The low-angle shift in the camera perspective, that sudden deliberate repositioning, indicates she had unbuckled the chest strap of her Osprey pack. In the high-altitude silence of the Sierra, every movement is an expenditure of precious oxygen. Why would a woman of her experience standing on a narrow granite spine risk the stability of her load? The analysis of the background pixels in frame 44,092 reveals a shimmering distortion on the horizon, a phenomenon known in mountain meteorology as a, quote, 14. These clouds, shaped like smooth lenses, are harbingers of extreme turbulence and rapid pressure drops. It is possible Evelyn saw the weather turning with a ferocity the morning forecast hadn't predicted. The deepening of her breath, captured by the GoPro's internal microphone, wasn't just exertion. It was the physiological response to a sudden spike in adrenaline. Imagine the internal calculation, the distance to the next sheltered cirque versus the speed of those approaching clouds. She was a woman who lived by the clock and the compass. At 11:36 a.m., the metadata shows a GPS drift of approximately 12 meters to the east. In the world of forensic storytelling, this drift is a ghost. It suggests she had moved off the established Chakye, quote, 15, and onto the slick, unweathered granite of the eastern face. The incline here exceeds 45 degrees. To a casual observer, it is a slope. To a mountaineer, it is a slide. The, quote, 16 pours over this specific 3-minute window, looking for the exact second the expert became the victim. Between the repositioning of the camera and the final gasp at 11:39 a.m., there is no dialogue. There are no screams. There is only the rhythmic, metallic, quote, 17 of her carbon fiber trekking poles hitting the rock. It is a sound of competence. It is the sound of a woman who believes she is still in control. Then the gasp. It is a sharp, aspirated sound, the sound of someone surprised by gravity. The camera's violent jolt marks the moment of detachment. In the reconstruction, we see the physics of tragedy. The GoPro, clipped to the now loose strap, is whipped away as her body undergoes a sudden lateral shift. The rule of irony dictates that the very tool she used to document her mastery became the only witness to her erasure. As the camera tumbled into the gully, it continued to record for several minutes, capturing the sound of sliding shale and the distant fading echo of a stone-on-stone impact that might have been a person or might have been the mountain merely settling. When the search teams of 2005 scanned this area, they were looking for a body in a red jacket. They were looking for a bright, high-visibility tent. They were looking for the expert victim, who surely would have sought shelter. They didn't look in the deep, shadow-filled fissures where a camera, and perhaps its owner, might be wedged beneath 5 years of seasonal snowmelt and granite dust. The evidence log found in her abandoned car at the trailhead 3 weeks after she vanished included a half-eaten energy bar and a map with a circle around a peak she never reached. These items, so ordinary in isolation, become relics when viewed through the lens of the void. They are the artifacts of a future that was cut off by a single catastrophic misstep. Why would she have unbuckled that strap? Why would she have turned toward the east face? These are the open-loop questions that keep the narrative of Evelyn Reed alive in the digital forums of the obsessed. The mountains don't explain why, they simply provide the stage for the disappearance. The forensic casual observer notes that at this altitude, the metadata of a human life, the heat, the movement, the intent, is stripped away by the wind in a matter of hours. What remains is the plastic and the silicon. The discovery of the camera in 2010 didn't just provide answers, it provided a timeline of a collapse. It allowed the investigators to move from the Marn Ide, quote, 21 C nays to the Qarn, quote, Cine 2. But the Cide, quote, 23 barns remains a fragmented emphasis. At 11:41 a.m., the camera had come to rest. The lens was partially obscured by a sprig of mountain heather. For the next 6 minutes, the file recorded nothing but the wind. It is a haunting, hollow sound, a 12,000-foot white noise. If Evelyn was still alive at that moment, she was out of frame. She was out of reach. The silence of the recording is a proxy for the silence of the search. The mountains keep their secrets, but they occasionally surrender a fragment of the truth, usually when it is too late to matter to anyone but the chroniclers of the lost. The, quote, 24, Sia, of Evelyn Reed is not that she died. Mountains claim experts every year. It is the precision with which she documented her own vanishing. The GoPro didn't just fall, It survived to tell us exactly when the light went out. Every frame of the static-filled archival footage from the 2005 search now feels like a missed opportunity, a frantic scanning of the wrong horizon. The grieving investigator looks at the 2005 helicopter logs and sees that a bird of prey, the call sign for the thermal unit, flew within 300 yards of the camera's location on October 2nd. The thermal imaging would have shown nothing. The camera was cold. Evelyn, by then, would have been cold. The justice we seek through memory is a cold comfort. It is an analytical reverence. We look at the macro shots of the rust on the camera's mounting screw and we see the passage of 1,825 days of solitude. Imagine you are standing on that ridge now, 5 years later. The wind is the same. The granite is the same. But the air feels thinner because you know what it swallowed. The moral warning is etched into the very metadata of the files. Expertise is a shield, but it is not an armor. The mountains are indifferent to your resume. They are indifferent to your preparedness. At 11:47 a.m., the camera's internal logic determined the file was complete and closed the recording. It was a digital amen. The reconstruction of the narrative truth tells us that Evelyn's journey ended not with a bang, but with a gasp and a 3-second tumble. The rest is just geography. Why would she do this? Why would she risk the eastern face? Perhaps the answer isn't in the geography, but in the psychology of the, quote, 27, the belief that one can always negotiate with the terrain. But the terrain does not negotiate. It only accepts. The evidence log of her life remains incomplete without her, a series of items in a backpack waiting for a wearer who will never return. We are left with the, quote, 28, a process of peeling back the layers of time to find a woman who exists only in high-definition 1080p, forever walking toward a pass she will never cross. The rhythmic echoes of her trekking poles continue to play in the minds of those who watch the footage, a heartbeat made of carbon fiber and stone. The mountains keep their secrets, but they leave the camera behind to remind us that we were there, for a moment, before the void took over. The next phase of the investigation would focus on the, quote, 29, quote, and whether it suggested a deliberate detour or a panicked flight. But in the somber reality of the Sierra, a detour and a flight often look exactly the same in the dirt. No signal, no trace, just the wind. The transition from the discovery of the physical object to the reconstruction of the narrative truth requires a clinical detachment from the horror of the event. In the third phase of the forensic chronicle, we move into the reconstruction, the assembly of a digital ghost. Following the 2010 discovery, the investigative team, led by a specialist in high-altitude forensics named Detective Sarah Miller, began the process of, quote, 30. This involves layering the GoPro's metadata onto a three-dimensional topographic map to create a life trace. At 11:34 a.m., when Evelyn Reed repositioned her camera, the GPS coordinates registered as 36 degrees, 76.45 degrees north, 118 degrees, 37.51 degrees west. This is the precise point of the pivot. The imagery shows a shift from the horizon to the ground directly in front of her. Macro shots of the granite in the footage reveal a subtle dark sheen, black ice, or verglas. This is the invisible killer of the High Sierra. It forms when snow melts in the midday sun and flash freezes in the shadows of the peaks. Evelyn, the expert, would have known this. The grieving investigator notes that in frame 52,001, her left trekking pole makes contact with a patch of this verglas. There is no sound of a grip, only a sharp sliding scree. The rule of irony is highlighted here. Her poles, designed to provide 4 points of contact for stability, became the very instruments of her instability. The poles did not plant, they skated. At 11:35 a.m., the footage shows a sudden, frantic movement of her hands. She is reaching for the granite, her fingers clad in reinforced climbing gloves, searching for a crimper or a jug, any crack in the rock to arrest her momentum. The expert victim does not scream, she calculates. We see the lens capture a blur of her red Gore-Tex sleeve, a flash of color against the gray. The timestamp pacing here becomes agonizingly slow. Between 11:35:02 and 11:35:08, she is in a controlled slide. 6 seconds. In 6 seconds, a human mind can process a lifetime of training, yet the mountain remains indifferent to the curriculum. The evidence log of the camera's final standing position reveals a harrowing detail. The mounting bracket of the GoPro was not broken by a fall, it was unscrewed. This suggests that in the final seconds of her life, or perhaps just before the terminal slide, Evelyn Reed tried to remove the camera. Why would she do this? The open-loop question suggests a final act of communication. She knew she was going over the edge. She knew the camera was her only witness. She wasn't just falling, she was leaving a message. The quote begins to coalesce around a singular, heartbreaking possibility that she threw the camera clear of her body to ensure it would be found. The mountains keep their secrets, but Evelyn Reed tried to force them to speak. At 11:39 a.m., the quote 40 US recorded is not one of pain, but of a sudden loss of atmospheric pressure as she crossed the threshold of the ridge. The camera, now loose, tumbles. The static-filled archival footage from the 2005 search shows the helicopters hovering over a section of the mountain called quote 41, quote nearly a mile away from the actual site. The quote 42 realizes that the search was based on her last known verbal check-in, not her last known digital heartbeat. The discrepancy is a chasm of 5 years. Imagine you are standing on that ledge, feeling the wind pull at your clothes, the camera in your hand, knowing that within seconds, you will be part of the mountain. The moral warning here is about the limits of technology. It can record our end, but it cannot prevent it. The reconstruction team used a process called quote 43 to recreate the final slide. By stitching together the blurred frames of the fall, they mapped the exact trajectory of the GoPro. It bounced 3 times, first off a granite spur, then into a patch of stunted alpine willow, and finally into the gully where it would wait for 1,825 days. The quote 44 analysis of the camera's exterior shows micro-pitting, a result of 5 years of sandblasting by high-altitude winds. The blue plastic was literally being eaten away by the environment. If the hikers had arrived a year later, the SD card might have been compromised by moisture. The timing of the discovery was as precise as the tragedy itself. The investigator obsesses over the thermal lag of the mountain, how the rock holds heat long after the sun sets. On the night of September 22, 2005, the temperature at 12,000 feet dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Without a tent, without her pack, which had been lost in the initial tumble, Evelyn would have faced a metabolic crisis within 90 minutes. The expert victim would have known this. She would have known that the void was not just a place, but a countdown. Why would she do this? Why would she push so far into the late season? The rhetorical echoes of her journals recovered from her home speak of a need to finish the line. She was chasing a completion that the mountain refused to grant. The narrative structure of the iterative forensic reveal now points toward the final missing piece, the location of Evelyn herself. The GoPro provided the where of the fall, but the where of the body remained a mystery until 2011, when a specialized grieving investigator team returned to the coordinates with ground-penetrating radar. They found that the gully where the camera landed was actually the top of a talus fan, a massive pile of loose rock that shifts and breathes with the seasons. The mountain had buried her in a slow-motion landslide of its own making. The evidence log of the 2011 recovery is a somber list. 1 titanium climbing watch stopped at 1:14, 1 wedding band, the fragments of a red jacket. The watch's stoppage suggests she survived the fall for nearly 2 hours. 2 hours in the silence, 2 hours in the thin air. The mountains don't explain why, and they don't apologize for the time they take. The quote 57 is that Evelyn Reed died as she lived, with a granular attention to the world around her, documenting the very forces that were undoing her. The slow pans over the weathered objects in the lab, the rusted buckle of her pack, the frayed nylon of her strap, serve as a reminder that we are all just quote 58 quote in the eyes of the earth. The quote 59 of the GoPro was the mountain's only concession. It gave us the tape, but it kept the soul. At the end of the reconstruction, we are left with a fragmented emphasis. No signal, no trace, just a memory etched in silicon. The documentary essayist concludes that the mystery isn't how she died, but why we are so desperate to watch the footage of her doing it. It is the search for justice through memory, the need to know that someone was watching when the light went out. The aftermath of the Reed case transformed the geography of the Sierra Nevada into a map of forensic mourning. For the quote 61, the closure provided by the 2011 recovery was purely physical. The narrative closure remained as elusive as the high-altitude air. When the final report was filed, the quote 62 of Evelyn's recovered pack told a story of a woman who was prepared for everything except the specific treachery of the mountain's memory. Inside the main compartment, a satellite beacon with the safety pin still engaged, 3 liters of water, and a topographical map where her finger had traced a path she would never walk. This is the quote 63 in its final, cold state. The tools of survival found mere meters from the site of the failure. The Cinnamon quote 64.4, distilled from the GoPro's metadata, created a shift in search and rescue protocols worldwide, introducing the Kaubano quote 65 by a mathematical acknowledgement of how Kwakadawa quote 66 often travel further and into more dangerous terrain than the search models predict, because they believe their skill can negate the environment. But the environment is a constant, skill is a variable. At 1:14 p.m., the time her watch finally surrendered to the cold, the sun would have been dipping behind the jagged teeth of the minarets. The quote 67. Reconstruction of her final 2 hours suggests she didn't move from the spot where she landed. The trauma of the fall was secondary to the onset of hypothermia. The grieving investigator imagines her there, looking up at the ridge, watching the camera she had thrown clear, hoping it would do exactly what it did 5 years later. It was a digital message in a bottle cast into a sea of granite. Why would she do this? To ensure her disappearance wasn't a void, but a story. The quote 69 of the case still haunt the forums of mountaineers. The mountains keep their secrets, but they don't always keep our records. The visual cues of the final investigation are the most haunting. Macro shots of the metadata of the human body, the way the calcium in her bones had begun to bond with the limestone of the talus. She was becoming the mountain. The impossible discovery of the GoPro was a fluke of erosion, a moment where the wind shifted the right way at the right time for a father and son to see a glint of blue. If not for that glint, Evelyn Reed would still be a missing poster fading in a ranger station. The documentary essayist looks at the final frame of the GoPro footage, that blurred mosaic of rock and heather, and sees the moral warning for us all. We obsess over the granular details, the timestamps, and the GPS drift because we want to believe that if we understand the how, we can avoid the when. But the mountains don't explain why, they simply remain. Imagine you are standing on that 12,100-foot pass today. You might find a small, unauthorized cairn of stones marking the spot. You might feel the same wind that caught her red sleeve. You might even check your own gear, tightening a strap, checking a buckle, feeling the weight of your own preparedness. But as the sun sets, casting long, bruised shadows over the gully, you realize that your presence there is temporary, while the mountain's silence is absolute. The quote 76 we sought for Evelyn Reed is served not by the recovery of her body, but by the preservation of her final deliberate act, the throwing of the camera. She refused to be a mystery. She chose to be a chronicle. The final quote 77 is now closed. The camera sits in a museum of search and rescue, its blue casing a testament to 5 years of solitude. The files have been backed up, mirrored, and analyzed until the pixels have lost their meaning. No signal, no trace, just the wind. The mountains keep their secrets, but for one brief digital moment, Evelyn Reed forced them to speak. And in that speech, we find the only truth the high country offers. We are guests in a place that does not know our names. The story of the climber who vanished in 2005 ends here, not with a resolution, but with a reverence for the void she left behind. The mountains don't explain why. They never did. They never will.